Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today's video I am going to be explaining the slash execute command. I'm going to be explaining it in terms of how useful it is for data packing, which is, it is immeasurable. It's literally the most common command I use. Outside of data packing, in a normal creative world, it doesn't really have uses other than that you can change dimensions with teleport, but yeah, so I'm going to be talking about data packing. So yeah, with that all out of the way, what I'm first going to be talking about is all of the different subcommands, so you can kind of, understand how it all works. And then I'm going to talk about some of the uses for it. Um, it doesn't have, like, you can do so much with it, so I'm only going to be talking about a couple things that you might not think of, but it is honestly just the most useful command there is in data packing. But yeah, with that all out of the way, let's get started. Alright, so what is execute? Okay, so basically what execute does is it allows you to change the way a command is executed, right? Whether or not that be changing who is running the command, or where the command is being run, or whether or not just having a condition for the command running entirely, you can just change the way a command is run. Um, so the most common thing that you do is use as and at. So what as does is run the command as a player or an entity, right? So you can say, hey, that entity is running this command. So what you then do is say execute, for example, as at A, and then say run, say hi, right? So now you see what that did was that every single player online, me and my alt account, said hi. You can also obviously use any selector, so execute as at S would result in only me saying hi. You can use at R for a random player each time. The basics, right? Then, why the at subcommand is useful is because that changes the position to the position of a player or an entity, right? So you can say, hey, as at S. That's the most common one. So what that would do is as the player or entity that's running this command at their position, right? So what you can do is say, hey, as every single player who matches some criteria, we'll get to that, run at their position, set block command for fire, right? Yeah, that's basically it. And it's honestly the thing you use most. Then, well, like I said, conditions. So what that is you can add if or unless, opposites of each other. Basically, if you add if, it checks whether or not a condition is true, and if you add, unless, it checks if it's false, right? So if you, for example, do block, then you can say, hey, if this block at these coordinates is oak planks, then run the command. Or you can say, hey, unless the block at these coordinates is oak planks, run the command, right? Also very useful. So what you have is block, which checks for a block at a certain coordinates, or block tag, so a group of blocks. Or you can have also at the end a block state, so you can say, hey, if a button is actively being pressed, run this command, which is, well, very useful if you have a find button map or something like that. And you can also have MBT data, but that's a bit laggy because it's MBT data. Yeah, that's basically all that there is to execute if block. Blocks is another option. What that does is you might expect it to just have more coordinates. No. You can compare sections of blocks. So you can, for example, say this corner to that corner, right? Then, it looks at that, it knows the size of it, it knows all the blocks in it. Then you give a third set of coordinates, and then it sees, hey, is that section matching, right? So it sees the size, and then you can say, hey, okay, are those all the same blocks? And then at the end, what you can add is all or masked. So, and that determines whether or not you want all blocks to match, or if blocks that are air blocks, so just air, should be ignored or masked, if you want to use their term. It's not actually that useful in terms of data packing, because you rarely can assure that a certain section of blocks is a specific block, because it's a survival world. Players can build wherever they want. But from time to time, you do find a use for it. Then, just going down the list, execute if data. That checks whether or not there is data stored at all, right? So you can say, hey, execute if there is data inside of this entity on their armor, on their helmet slot, right? Which says, hey, okay, is there any data stored for their helmet, right? Yes, continue, no, do nothing. There are also, entity block storage. I'm not going to go into those because that deserves to be in the /data tutorial. Watch that if that's out already. Then, next one, if entity. Really fun. You can check if a certain selector results in any entities, right? So, if entity at S, run say hi. So if there isn't at S, run hi. Now, what you can add to that, for example, is checking for a tag, or anything that a selector can add. For example, check if name equals command Witchery, right? So for me, that always results hi, because I'm command Witchery, but if I add an as at A in front, so for every single player that's online, if their name is command Witchery, say hi. And still, even though everyone runs it, nothing actually gets run for anyone other than me. Really quite useful in quite a lot of circumstances. And if predicates, you can check a predicate. You don't know what a predicate is yet. It's not that needed. It's useful for some optimizational things. I'll probably make a video entirely about predicates at some point. And then lastly, you have execute if score. So that is where you can check for a scoreboard for a player or fake player or an entity at all, if that matches some value, right? So you can check, hey, if score at S for test, and then you have a bunch of random things that are confusing, right? First of all, the matches, which is not one of the symbols, you can say matches, and there you can just input some number, right? So you can say, hey, if it matches 1, then continue. You can also make it a range by adding 2 dots in front or behind it. And that says, hey, if it's 1, and then if you add 2 dots behind it, it says if it's 1 or above. Or if you add them in front of it, if it is 1 or below. But if sometimes you want to compare an entity's score to another entity's their score. That's also possible. So you can say, hey, if score for at S for the scoreboard is equal to the sign, and then you say another entity, or the same entity, and another scoreboard, or the same scoreboard, and then see if they match. Then what all the other ones do is, well, just the simple greater than, smaller than, greater than or equal to, smaller or equal to, right? And that's all of the if statements, options done. Obviously, unless invert it. Right. That is 2 out of 5 done. Let's continue now. Yeah, like I said, the execute command is very important and is absolutely massive. So the next thing that you can do, also very important, although not quite as often used, but still very important, is you can store the result of a command. So let's right. So what you say is store, and then you actually have two options. The most common is store the result of a command, but you can also store the success of a command, right? So if you say, hey, kill every single player. If there are no players online, it would fail, right? So if you store success, if it killed anything, it would result in the output being 1. If it killed nothing, it would be 0. If you store result, then it stores the amount of players it killed, I think. The output varies per command. For example, /effect give would result the amount of entities you did. But obviously particle would just result in a 1 or a 0 because it shouldn't do anything else, right? So yeah, it just kind of outputs the number that it would. Most useful for this is using /data to get some data of a specific, entity, and then storing it into a value of a scoreboard, which is significantly easier to check. But yeah, if you say store result, then now you have 5 options, right? The first option is store into a block. That is basically the same as storing it into an entity, so we'll cover those at the same time. Also about the same as a storage, so we'll do all 3 at once. Basically, you can store it into data, right? So you can, for instance, say, hey, get the score of this player, right? And then store it into an entity. You can't do it into a player because they hate us. So what you would, for example, do is say, hey, if the amount of ticks that I'm going to be on fire, if you want to have a custom fire thing, the entity is going to be on fire, for as long as that is 1 or above, that, you can set it on fire. Or you can say store the amount of ticks that's going to be on fire into the entity fire thingy, right? Or you can change the position of an entity to be any number you want, right? Dynamic, delightful, amazing. Then, well, like I mentioned, you can also store it into a scoreboard, so you can do the inverse. Get an entity's position, store it into a scoreboard. And lastly, quite fun, you can store it into a boss bar, right? So, for example, you at the end would say, hey, get the score of this player for boss bar value, and then store it into the value of the boss bar. So suddenly the boss bar represents that player's score. You can also store it into the max value of a boss bar, so how much the width of it represents, right? So if it's full width, normally that's 100, but you could set it to 200, right? Storing into the max value is not that common. You generally just store it into a value. But from time to time you want to have a dynamic max value, and then this is useful. But yeah, that's a very chaotic explanation of the /store subcommand. Right. And now the last 2 options, 2 or 3 or 4 or 1, depending on how you categorize them. Basically, these are all changing the position or the rotation of where it is being run, right? So you can use the position subcommand to say, hey, I want it to be run in, and then, you give it a set of coordinates. So either, 0, 0, 0, or 1 block above me, or 1 block in the direction that I am looking, right? Then you have rotation, right? Rotated. And there, you can either add an as, so then you can say this should be rotated as this entity, or you can give it just 2 coordinates, right? So, your yaw and your pitch, or you can give it relative yaw and pitch, simple, just like the F3 screen, right? Also, I completely forgot to mention, positioned can also be run as an entity, so you can say, hey, this is at the position of that entity, but not with a rotation, because at normally also includes rotation. Then you have align, which I didn't actually know what it did, but I googled it for this video, and I'm going to be using that quite a lot. what align does is it takes the coordinates that it's being run at, and it makes them all, it rounds them all downwards, right? So instead of it being run, for example, if I run it at my position, instead of being right here, it would, for example, be right there, because of it being, floored, it being lowered. What you can add is an X, and a Y, and a Z in any order if you want, right? So basically, if you add a line X, what it does is it floors the X coordinate. If you say align Z, for Z. If you say XZ, it floors this, XZ coordinates. If you say ZX, same thing. XYZ, all of them, right? So that's very useful if you want to have a particle, or if you want to, summon an entity at where the block begins instead of in the center of it. It is super useful. And then lastly, you have the in subcommand. What that does is specifies what dimension the command should be run at. So you can say, overworld, nether, end, or any custom biome that you've made. Sorry, not biome, dimension, right? So yeah, that should be all subcommands handled. Okay, cool. That took 15 minutes. It's fine. Now onto the uses of it, like the kind of niche uses that you might think of. Basically, well, you can run add at A, add at S, run say hi, right? But then if you also want another command, say hi to, then you would need to run both of those. But the subcommands in front of them are the exact same, as at. And while, running that twice, it doesn't really mean anything. But now imagine if you run a couple hundred of the exact same subcommands. That is going to take some resources away from the game when it really doesn't need to, right? Because what you can do is say execute as this entity at their position, run that function, right? So that function will then suddenly be a group of commands run as the entity at their position without really any more lag. The subcommands only trigger once and change it once, and just like that, it's good. That also works with conditions, so you can say, hey, if this thing is true, then shoot a fireball. And then that shooting fireball thing is 10 different commands and different function, but that would be just as efficient as if you just ran it once, manually. Really quite useful. I highly recommend using that whenever you can. So whenever you see, subcommands being the exact same, like as and at or an if statement, just copy them all into a new function and run that with those subcommands. And then you have it a lot more optimized for your game. And the other one that I kind of already mentioned, you can check a scoreboard in combination with using a store command to actually check MBT data for an entity or a storage, right? That's actually also pretty useful, and you can't really do otherwise. Or well, you can check if it has a value, but you can't really check if the value is equal to a 5 or above, right? You can't do anything like that. You can technically check if it's specifically 5, but that's... in some cases, that gets a bit laggy and stuff. It's a bit finicky. But like this, as long as you have numeric empty data, so it stores a number. So like your position, for example. Then you can check that. you should note that obviously your position, as I'm right here, for example, it isn't just a round number. So it obviously rounds it downwards so that it, can actually store a whole number instead of pesky commas, right? But yeah, you can also, in the store command, execute store, add a multiplier if you store it into an entity, right? So if you say, hey, store into my, actually no, don't store it into mine because you can't change the player MBT data. If you store it into a zombie's position, do that and that. But what you should be aware of is, first of all, data types. So like I mentioned, a scoreboard is a round number, but there are actually quite a lot of data types. So you can, have a byte, a double, a float, an int, a long, or a short. So basically what that means is byte you don't really want to use, short you don't really want to use, double is a comma, with commas, number. As is float, Minecraft uses them interchangeably, basically. But if you try to store double into a float, it will fail. So for instance, position, that is double, but health, that is a float. And then you have integer, which is just a number. And then you have long, which is just a number, but then longer. So yeah. But yeah, with that all said and done, that is a way too chaotic explanation of the /execute command. 20 minutes? I mean, 21, but yeah, I think that's pretty decent, right? I think that's quite impressive that I could get all that done. Yeah, with that all said and done, I hope you enjoy. If you learn something and want to learn more, consider subscribing, because I do this quite often from time to time. I'm bad with my upload schedule, but I'll try to be better, I promise. But that's all that. Also consider leaving a like. If you have any questions or any corrections, if I made any mistakes, feel free to leave them in the comment section. And if you correctly noticed any errors, or if there's a often asked question, I will edit my description so that I tell you, hey, this thing I missed, this is how it works, so you don't get any errors. So if you, are interested, look in the description and you can see some corrections if I make any mistakes. But yeah, that should be it. That should be all. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one. Goodbye, everyone.